Hey y'all, it's me Sydney and welcome back to Planet Sid. So today we are at the Planet Sid radio station and we are going to be discussing Set It Off and the plight of poor Black women. So if you guys are interested in that, then stay tuned. And yeah, welcome to Planet Sid Radio. I guess welcome back to me. Well, welcome. I don't know. It's been a minute since I have uploaded. I just turned 26 a few days ago and 25 did a number on me, but we made it through. And that's all that matters. And so I am back and I am better. And I've been putting a lot of thought and planning and preparation into this channel. As you can see, I mean, you guys will just see as I post videos, but be sure to check out planetsyd.net. I put a lot of effort into the website and I think you guys are going to love this new chapter that we are entering in this community that I am cultivating. I did have a mic. I'm using this mic right now, as you can see, so I still get good audio. I got the wrong cord. So like the cord that I got is supposed to plug into here, and it's the right cord, but it's like they're both output, so it doesn't plug in. So I couldn't look at it. It was giving radio. I had a whole stand and everything. Anyways, the next episode of Planet Sid Radio, it will be fully up and running, and I know y'all see the lore in the back. Today's mocktail, we're drinking a green tea mojito. So this is just a green tea bag, some lemonade, a little bit of water, and some mint leaves and some ice. And so yes, that is our mocktail for the day. So Set It Off is a certified hood Black classic. If you know, you know. And honestly, Queen Latifah should have gotten an Oscar for that, but I digress. She should have gotten an Oscar for a lot of things, and she will get her due one of these days. I am manifesting that for my lesbian queen. But anyways, I digress. This is about 4 female Black friends who live in South Central LA, and they decide to basically rob a bank for a myriad of reasons. And so it just takes us through that journey of how they ended up to the point of deciding to rob a bank and following through on it, and the fallout of what happens after that. And so I would just suggest, if you haven't seen it already, first and foremost, go see it. It's an amazing movie, and it's Black History Month. Support Black women, and yeah, check it out. So in the beginning of the film, we get introduced to the first character, which is Frankie, and she is played by Vivica A. Fox. Shout out to her. And the movie starts at the bank, and she works there. She's a bank teller, and basically a robbery happens, and she recognizes the person before the robbery even pops off. His name is Darnell, I believe. And so she's like, "Oh, I didn't know you had an account here. How can I help you?" This and that, the third. And then he pulls out a gun, and he's like, open the drawer, and it's a robbery. And she's like freaking out and everything. And then he starts shooting people, and then it's like this other guy in the back. He comes in, and it was a huge bank robbery, and she ended up watching somebody get unalived right in front of her, and there's blood splatter all over her, and it was very vivid and traumatizing, I can imagine. And then so after this whole robbery, which was just a traumatizing event for her, she ends up getting interrogated by the police, and then her job ends up firing her because they believe that she's an accomplice, even though she's not. They are literally just 2 Black people, and they just happen to grow up in the same neighborhood. But these are rich, older white people, and so they're just like, get your Black ass on, basically. And it was really sad. It was really sad. So after this, since Frankie don't got a job no more, she still needs to pay her bills. So she goes and works with her 3 best friends. And these are the other 3 main characters. And they work at Luther's, which is a low-paying cleaning service job. So they clean these corporate offices, and they like take out the trash and do like janitorial work, basically. And so the next character we get introduced to is Stony, and she is played by my girl Jada Pinkett Smith. Shout out to her. And she is taking care of her brother with no help. Both of their parents died in an accident a few years before, so they're all each other has. And she's just helping him, trying to raise him up in hopes that he'll be on his way to college and be able to kind of change both of their lives. And then we soon after that get introduced to Cleo, who is played by the queer queen, Queen Latifah. Is it Dana Owens? I think that's her name. Anyway, she is this young, butch, queer woman, and she has her little girlfriend Ursula. Ursula don't say a goddamn word in the entire film, but that don't got nothing to do with nothing. But anyways, lastly there is TT, and she is played by the amazing actress Kimberly Elise. She's kind of on a different vibe these days, but she's an amazing actress nonetheless. And TT, who is played by Kimberly Elise, she is a single mother. She has a young son, and basically we just get to see all of them in their day-to-day life and as they work at Luther's. And so long story short, eventually they all decide to rob a bank because Luther's wasn't cutting it first and foremost. It was a low paying job, and they were all kind of in these binds. If you know, you know, they were all in these financial binds that like they really needed money, and they also kind of just felt a degree of hopelessness because life was just lifing on them, and they were doing everything by the book and following all the rules. Well, at least most of them were, with the exception of Cleo. She is a criminal or whatever. But yeah, they were just tired of doing everything by the book, and so they just were like, we're gonna rob a bank. And they all end up in various situations to where like they really needed money immediately, and so the Luther's cleaning job wasn't going to cut it anyways. And so they're each desperate for money. And at one point, Stoney, which is played by Jada Pinkett Smith, she has to resort to sex work with this old creepy guy who's just like, I can help you out, but you got to give me some. I'm leaving with something. And so she has to resort to sex work to hopefully pay for her brother's tuition. But basically that didn't matter anyways because her younger brother lied about getting accepted into school, so she did that. But anyway, she did all that hoping that, you know, that'll be enough to pay for his classes. But after she brings him the check and everything, he's just like, oh wait, I didn't apply, I'm sorry to disappoint you, this, that, and the third, or whatever. And so that's was a downer. And then things go even worse for Stoney because there was just recently a bank robbery, and that's what resulted in Frankie getting fired. But the police are still looking for who these robbers are, and they don't know. And it's just these random guys in the hood or whatever. And so basically, long story short, it ends up being a case of mistaken identity, and they end up mistaking Frankie's younger brother, who's just a regular high school graduate who was hopefully going to go to college, for the robber, and he ends up being unalived by the police. And it's really sad. So now Frankie has nothing and nobody. And then so that's her situation, just really sad and depressing. And then there's TT, who is a single mother. Her son ends up in the system due to him ingesting some cleaning products because she had to take him to work because she couldn't afford childcare with taxes being taken out of her check, and Luther really didn't care. And so she had taken to work and do what she had to do, but he ended up in the Child Protective Services because he ingested chemicals. And so now she has to figure out how she's going to get him out of the system, and that costs money. And also, you know, if you at court and shit, you not at work, and you know, she ain't got it. Cleo is an interesting character. I really like the representation that we got with Cleo, but she does have a criminal past and like a criminal history, but she's this young, masculine presenting butch queer woman, and she has a little girlfriend, Ursula. And Luther, he be dogging all of them, but he really be dogging specifically TT and Cleo, and like just be saying like real, like slightly homophobic shit to Cleo. Cleo is just like a day-to-day whatever. I think she just takes life as it is and then just tries to go take it day by day. So yeah, that's her thing, and she like steals cars and stuff. And then there's Frankie, who we got introduced at first, who was the bank teller who was wrongfully terminated from her corporate job at the bank. Those are all the situations that they're put into where they're just down and out. So they come up with a plan to rob the bank because the number one pressing issue is that TT needs to get her son out of the system, and she needs money to do that. So that's a very condensed order of events, but basically after all four of the women decide to rob the bank, the police slowly start to close in on them because they're wondering if that bank robbery was connected to the first one that really set everything off. Ooh, no pun intended. So yeah, if you haven't seen the film, I recommend that you see it because first and foremost, it's an amazing crime thriller. And it's just one of those good 90s black movies, and it has just such amazing performances from everybody, and all four of the women who are leading it, of course. So now I want to talk about the system. Just to break it down, just from the very beginning, the audience gets a very clear picture that all of the women are in very unfavorable circumstances and that they have to do something to get out. And they don't really have any good choices. They don't have any good legal choices to make as far as ways to get them out of their situations and to improve their lives. And so, yeah, just really, they were all just in between a rock and a hard place because, of course, Stoney, which is played by Jada Pinkett Smith, she's poor and she has no family. And TT is a single mother, and now her son got taken away from her, so she has to figure out how she's going to get him out of the system. Cleo is poor as well, and she lives in a garage. And then Frankie lost her job, and so now she's working at this cleaning place with the rest of the girls. And so they're just all in really shitty circumstances, and it's really unfortunate. And I think what's so interesting is that they all now work for this cleaning company, Luther's, and it's owned by Luther, who is the shittiest boss you ever fucking meet. So while they're cleaning these huge corporate offices and stuff, it's more than evident that these four women are destitute and they feel it's damn near impossible to try and build a better life for themselves, because that's just not how the system is set up. Because again, even when they try and do everything quote unquote right, they end up in even worse positions than how they started in. And we get to see this at the very beginning of the movie when Frankie is working her normal corporate white collar job. You know, she's a bank teller. She seems to be employee of the month. She was talking about how she counted $250,000 by hand and whatnot. And, you know, she was working there and, you know, slowly but surely climbing the corporate ladder, trying to make it better for herself. But then just because somebody else decided to rob the bank and she's just black and she just happened to know who the person was, she gets fired and now she has to start completely over. If you ever worked in the service industry, I'm sure you've encountered a boss at one point in time like Luther. But yeah, he just doesn't respect them at all. And he doesn't respect Cleo's sexual identity. He doesn't respect the fact that TT is a single mother and that, you know, she needs support in other ways. And the thing I love about this film is that it really perfectly illuminates this expectation that poor working class people in America have to be silent, servile, and invisible. And the more marginalized you are within that community, the more you're expected to tolerate, which is sad. So it's like no matter how demeaning the treatment is, you just kind of have to deal with it, or you're expected to deal with it, because realistically you don't have any other options. And you can see this in stark contrast every time the women are at work, because they are cleaning these huge corporate environments. And I'm talking skyscrapers, and where the people there probably make 6 to 7 figures a year. Like, these are affluent white people, but they are barely making enough to survive. Each of these women are making pennies on the dollar, and it just really encapsulates how in the world, but specifically here in America, how blue collar workers really literally keep the world running. But again, they're being paid pennies on the dollar. And it's just sad. And honestly, from my personal experience, I would choose anything over having to go back to fast food and customer service. Like, never again. Those jobs that I had to work in high school and like my first few years of college, oh my God. Oh my God. It was the bosses, it was the customers, it was the environment. My feet was hurting, my back was hurting. Like, and it's so crazy because I work hard. I work relatively hard. You know, I still work to this day. Like, I work hard, but the type of work that I do now compared to the type of work that I did like 5-6 years ago, it just does not even compare on just the emotional, the mental, the physical labor and the wear and tear of just working in the food service industry and just basically being at the bottom of the food chain. It doesn't matter how much, I mean, in general, you're not going to get paid that much, but it really doesn't matter how much you get paid, because to me personally, it just wasn't worth it for what I got out of it. And also, I just don't like dealing with people and customers and shit. So I'm just so grateful to have had access to other opportunities, because it is hard and grueling. If you ever worked in sex work, customer service, food service, any of that, then you know. Like, it's just, no. It's like the less you get paid, the harder you have to work. And the more they know you are dependent on that job, and like the more that they know that you are marginalized. So whether you're just young and like maybe you don't have a lot of family, or you don't have guidance, or you really, really need this job, a lot of times you just get mistreated by customers and by management, this, that, and the third. And you can really see that and Set It Off as well, because Luther just be dogging them any chance he get just because he fucking feel like it. And I genuinely do believe, just from personal experience, that sometimes people will treat you like shit if they feel that you don't have any other options, and just because you don't have anywhere else to go. Like, kind of like a doormat or like a punching bag. Like, they know you're most likely not going to go anywhere because you don't have any other options, and so they get gratification from punching down, because in a way, like, the world punches down on them. So it's just like this cycle of abuse. But also they get this gratification from knowing that there's somebody to punch down on. Like, there's this pride that they have in not being at, like, even if I am at the bottom, I'm not at the bottom of the bottom or whatever. Does that make sense? But yeah, anyways, back to the movie. It's safe to assume that none of these four women want to work at Luther's, but it's the best options that they have at the moment. And Luther is a shitty person, period, again, but it's interesting to see the difference in how he interacts with Cleo and TT versus how he interacts with Stoney and Frankie. Because of course they all need a job. They all broke as hell, but Cleo and TT really need to keep a job. because again, Cleo, she's been formerly incarcerated. She's poor, black, and queer, and she lives in a garage. So it's safe to assume that she doesn't have the best financial situation. But also just with those identities within each other and being in LA and, being plus size and black and queer in 1996, like I'm sure it would have been hard for somebody like that to climb the corporate ladder and to be on a straight arrow. And so I'm just assuming it'll be more of a challenge for her to navigate professional and workspaces, just because she has to deal with people's biases and ignorance. She just has to deal with people and their ideas of whatever they feel that she represents. And then with TT, again, she's a single mother, and she can't even afford childcare with taxes being taken out of her check. She was damn near begging for Luther to pay her under the table, but he was like, no, because he don't mess with the IR or the S. And he ain't that one little thing, because neither do I. He just be dogging specifically Cleo and TT any chance that he gets, because again, this is what happens sometimes in marginalized communities with scarce resources. There's always somebody punching down on another person. And again, Luther, he owns Luther's. It's his business. Like, he's a business owner. So he has something like some type of capital, but he's a business owner. But he's also still a blue collar worker, because he's a business owner, but it's a cleaning service and he's still a black man. So I'm sure that Luther, a black man who has to take shit in his day-to-day life because he's interacting with these rich, affluent white people, he's being contracted by them, and he's interacting with people who I'm assuming would be in a higher socioeconomic position than him. He then passes that same trauma on to his employees that are slightly lower than him on that same hierarchy, because first they are women and they make even less money than him because they are his employees. And then also with Cleo and TT, Cleo is queer, so she's queer and a woman, and she's an employee. And then TT is a single mother, a woman, and an employee. And so it's just like the more, like, they're just quote unquote lower in the hierarchy. And I think that Luther really abuses that. It's almost like the more dependent that you are in the movie and just in life in general, like the more dependent that you are, the more susceptible you are to being abused, which is so sad. And this honestly reminds me of that conversation that the late Nikki Giovanni and the late James Baldwin had in 1973. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about, but I'll link it down below if you haven't. It's an amazing conversation. Also, RIP to her. This conversation that Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin had in 1973, they just basically discussed the relationship that black men and black women have with each other in America. And it was more so in a romantic sense, but I feel like it can be applied to this specific film and just more in a platonic way, because I think that black women and black men just have interesting dynamics, whether it be romantic or platonic. And so, yeah, I would feel like it could be applied to professional relationships as well in the context of this film. So what I mean by this comparison is that Luther and the four women in Set It Off, they just have this really interesting dynamic, because of course they are women, and then Luther is Luther and he's a black male, and so he represents this male energy or whatever. He also has that privilege because he's a male, and also he's their boss as well, and you can just see the power at play. But anyways, back to the conversation that James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni were having. James Baldwin, he basically discussed how draining it is to have to go through the world with a smile as a black man, because again, black men have to go through a lot of things, and you have to go to work and deal with all these people, and you kind of just have to smile and eat shit. And you're just constantly being mistreated. You don't really have the luxury of being a human, and you can't really let how said mistreatment affect your job and how you interact with other groups and systems that are constantly kicking down on you. Especially, again, this is in context of 1973, and James Baldwin, I want to say he was like 50 something. So he's just speaking on his life. And then so he begins to explain how him having to go through the day with this smile and having to just take shit from white people and everything, that influences how black men come home and interact with black women, because when they get home, they don't have to wear this mask and this smile, which they shouldn't have to an extent, because, you should go home and that should be your sanctuary, and you should, be able to be your true fullest self, whatever that is, whenever you're at home. But it's like you're drained and you're angry and upset about things that are so far out of your control, and it's not really anybody's fault that's at home, but you kind of take it out on the people that are at home, which would be the wife and kids in a romantic sense. And so James Baldwin, he was speaking from a place of just not wanting to come home and have to put on a mask. You want to be his real self, whether that be disappointed, annoyed, angry, or whatever, because he's had to suppress that whenever he's out in the world having to deal with white people all day. And so to counter that, Nikki Giovanni, her point was, she then asked, this is a viral part of the interview where she's like, okay, well, why can't you fake it with me? Because in her defense, Black women, we have to endure mistreatment as well. She's just like, why can't you fake it with me? You know, she's tired. She didn't have to deal with mistreatment or whatever, but then she has to come home and watch her husband come home, and she just has to receive that shitty treatment as well from somebody who should be somewhat of a sanctuary for her. Yes, so it's like you come home and this Black man is frustrated, but this Black woman is also just feeling the rage and brunt of a Black man feeling emasculated by systems that are out of both of their control. And it just kind of perpetuates this cycle of misdirected anger and abuse and trauma. This dialogue did happen again back in 1973, and this film, Set It Off, took place in 1996. And I feel like it's relevant then, both in 1973 and 1996, and I think it's still relevant now. So in context of the film, Luther is a business owner again, but he's still a contracted worker for this huge corporation that he gives cleaning services for. I wouldn't be surprised if at one point or another, or even on a daily basis, if these rich, affluent white people interacted with him as if he were a second-class citizen, because to them, even though he's a business owner, he's just the cleaning man. And so of course being privileged doesn't excuse not having manners or just not having couth, but you know how some people of a certain hue can be, especially back then. Sometimes people don't realize how much of a role chance and luck plays into how their life plays out, especially if you're just born into a world of privilege. But yeah, if you ever worked in the fast food customer service or done sex work, then you probably have encountered somebody at one point in time who is paying you for a service. They're paying you for a service. They need something from you, but they're treating you as if you are not a full human. Like, if you know, you know. We just live in a world that assigns value and virtue to what you do for work, how you look, your job, where you live, and things of the sort. So if you're at the bottom of that hierarchy, then you're going to feel it. And again, these are systemic issues that contributed to these women's circumstances. So what are they going to do? Because they just all going through it day by day, and the finances are not financing. Her son locked up with the people. The other brother then got killed. Like, it was just a lot going on. Like, these four women, they were up against misogyny, poverty, the child care system, single motherhood, police brutality, sexual exploitation, and homophobia. These are four poor Black women who live in South Central LA. They can't change the institutions of racism and capitalism. So their logic is, why not steal and take from a system that has been slowly killing them and has been stealing from them since the beginning of time? And the thing that was so heartbreaking specifically about this film is that they were demonized by a system for simply doing what they had to do to survive. And there was really no compassion. And you can see that in real life as well. But specifically in this film, it was just a constant reminder of just like, dang, it's hard out here for a pimp. The realities of living under capitalism, especially if you are at the bottom of the hierarchy or whatever, like, that reality is very bleak. And it was just hard watching Stoney, who lost her only remaining relative in the most horrific way to police brutality. And it was sad because Frankie, again, she had just experienced the trauma as well. And this happens in real life, you know. The world doesn't stop. If the worst possible thing happens, you still have to get up and go to work, especially if you don't have a financial safety net, or in her case, family as well, to kind of pick up the pieces that may be falling or whatever. And the same thing with Frankie. She just experienced the trauma as well. I'm sure being in a bank robbery is traumatizing. Also, she saw a woman get unalived literally 2 feet in front of her. And she's going to remember that for the rest of her life. But she has to worry about how she's going to get another job and how she's going to survive. So they don't even have time to process these very severe and real traumas. If they let those traumas genuinely affect them and sink in, they'll be depressed and homeless. And that's not fun. And so you can kind of see why those shitty situations that are so far out of anybody's control, why that can lead a person to a life of crime. It just sucks because they did everything quote unquote right, especially Frankie. You know, they all went to work and tried to get their money legally and be decent citizens, with the exception of Cleo, because she did have a little side hustle of crime. But besides that, their authorities and employers had no compassion for the traumas that they had just experienced. and the situations that they were in that really they didn't have control over, and they each in some way were flattened to be perceived as the worst stereotypes that were associated with poor, low-income inner-city Black women. You can see this in how Frankie's boss and the detectives interacted with her at the beginning of the film, right after the robbery, and they are just interrogating her and just like basically saying like, you have to be in on this, you have to be an accomplice. It was just so sad because she was really going, she still had blood stains on the shirt. She couldn't even process what the hell had just happened. And also you see this in how just rude and nasty Luther is. Luther is just trifling to Cleo, Stoney, TT, and Frankie. And the thing that was so ironic in the film was that the detectives who initially accused Frankie of being an accomplice, which she wasn't in the beginning, they eventually were assigned to the case whenever the four women did decide to start robbing banks. And because they were trying to see if those two robberies were connected. And so they end up meeting again. And also the detective who, they were also a part of the team, and the detectives who ended up unaliving Stoney's brother. So they just keep on meeting, and everything kind of just ties back to that initial fateful day of the first bank robbery. And so throughout the film, there's just this whole game of cat and mouse in between the four women and the police, and they just start closing in on them. And things start to get messy very quickly because obviously none of these women are real criminals, and they just get in over their heads very soon. And I can imagine, I mean, well, actually I can't. I don't plan on ever robbing a bank, but that would be a lot. So yeah, they just get in over their heads, and they just kind of are wigging out. Because why were they putting on their disguises as they were still walking into the bank? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Also, that was not another pun, wigging out. I am on it today. I'm hilarious. I make myself laugh. But anyways, after they robbed the first bank, they decide to plan another robbery because what they got from the first bank, they only got like $3,000. I want to say each, and like that's a little bit of change, but it wasn't a life-changing amount of money, and it was just like, that's, you know, to pay bills, you know. And so they only got a few $1,000s, and so then they decide to rob a second bank. And when they rob the second bank, it is more successful, and they get all this money and stuff, and they just like, okay, we about to just work how we normally do. We about to just go back to Luther's and just work, and then we're gonna figure out what we're gonna do with the money. And then so they hide the money in the vent at one of their jobs. And basically, long story short, Luther's raggedy ass finds it and steals it, and he just starts spending and fucking bitches, getting money all over town. He in this hotel room. He just fucked up a whole check with some money that wasn't his. It wasn't theirs either, but how you gonna steal from another thief? Like, it was just too much. He's in this hotel room with this white woman having a good old time, and then they bust in, and then basically it just all happened so fast. Luther pulls a gun out on Cleo and TT, and then before he even gets to do anything, TT just shoots him. And so instead of looking at robbery, they're also looking at murder now. And so the stakes just got raised a lot higher. And of course, Luther just spent all the goddamn money, so they're broke now. They're about to get put to jail for life. And so they're just like, okay, we're going to rob the federal bank, which is like the big bank, one final time, and then we're going to skip town and get the fuck up out of here. But we need money to do that, so that's what we're going to rob the bank for. And when they do this last final robbery, they was getting all this money, but then that's when the hell shit went left. They are in there, and eventually it just leads to a standoff with the police. And then TT, which is a single mother who's trying to get her son out of the system, she ends up getting shot, and eventually she wallows away. I'm not sure what the censorship shit is on YouTube. So yeah, she goes bye-bye. And there's just this whole shootout and the police chase, and it's real 90s crime thriller, whatever. It was given Bad Boys. But yeah, so now we're left with Stoney, Frankie, and Cleo, and they decide to split up and just all go their separate ways. The police are still chasing them, and this scene is just iconic whenever Cleo, she light that cigarette up, and then she just gets driving or whatever. And unfortunately, she gets got by the police as well. So she doesn't make it. She wallows away as well. And then the same thing happens with Frankie. So the only person that is left is Stoney, which is played by Jada Pinkett Smith. And basically, she was able to get on the bus and leave town. And as the bus was leaving, the shootout was happening. And she's just watching from the window on the bus. And then the detective who originally fired the detective who was so anyway, Stoney is on the bus now, and the bus is departing, and she's already sitting down in her seat and everything, and she's watching both of her friends get unalived by the police. And the only person who sees her is the detective. I want to say his name is Detective, I forgot, the white man, the white detective, the one who was originally the white man, the white detective, and the one who was originally interrogating Frankie at the beginning of the movie, which led to her getting fired from her job. And he looks up and he locks eyes with Stoney as she's on the bus, but he's just like, I think he realized how out of control everything got. And of course, this is still a movie because I don't think this will happen in real life, but he just lets her go on the bus. Like, he doesn't try and stop the bus or whatever. The bus is already leaving, and he's just like, I done kind of killed your little brother. I done kind of killed all your friends. Like, she don't got shit. Just let her go. Let her go. And then so that's when the movie starts to wrap up. And basically in the end, we see that Stoney, she was able to successfully escape to Mexico. And she basically was able to start a new life. And so she has all this money, and she's able to start a new life, but she's already lost so much. And now she has a lifetime ahead of her that doesn't include the community that she had, the little bit of community that she had. And that would also include grieving the loss of her best friends, finally grieving the loss of her younger brother. And then I'm sure she's still grieving the loss of her parents who died a few years before. And so it was just like a really bittersweet ending, at least in my personal opinion, because they were in a way all still killed by a system that was already killing them. And it just really sucked. But it did also kind of fill me up a little bit, especially with Cleo, that they all kind of decided to go out on their own. Really bittersweet because, again, Stoney has this new life, but all of her friends are gone, her brother's gone, and her parents are gone. So it's like, what does she really have? Also, throughout the film, she met this guy, Keith, and they really hit it off, and she ended up having to leave him behind as well. So anything that she had that was like of any substance or whatever, she had to leave it all behind. But she has herself and some money and a red Jeep in Mexico. So I'm sure she can make some shake. And it was all just kind of sad as well because it was all a chain of events that started with the initial bank robbery at the beginning of the film. And that ended up costing her life in the end. And again, it's this like chain of events that happens because had Frankie's job and the detective saw her as a victim and not as an accomplice, then she'll probably still have a job and she'll still be employed. And had the police not falsely identified Stoney's younger brother, he would still be alive and she'll probably feel, I'm sure that she's traumatized with him gone. He would still be alive. And had TT been able to afford childcare and just been being paid adequately, her son wouldn't be in the system because she wouldn't have had to bring him to work. And with Cleo, had the world been nicer and kinder and more compassionate to plus size Black queer women in the 1990s, she probably would have went down a completely different path. I feel like this film did an excellent job at highlighting just how much of a cycle poverty is and just how cyclical it can be and just how much of a trap it is to be poor and just how exhausting that can be in a world that forces you to show up because, again, the worst thing could happen, but you still have to go to work and bills are still due. We see throughout the film that Stoney is still processing the trauma of losing her younger brother in such a horrific way. And she still has to show up to work and deal with a boss like Luther, which I'm sure did a number on her. TT gets her child taken away by the system. She gets her child taken away because she couldn't afford childcare. And she has to find the money to appear in court. And of course, if she's in court, then she's not at work. It reminds me, what is that? In Little Fires Everywhere, where Kerry Washington is like, you didn't make good choices. You had good choices. Like, they didn't have good choices. You can see why those situations, they kind of felt forced and cornered into deciding to pursue a life of crime. Because I personally do believe that there is a relationship between crime and poverty. And I did do some research to back this up. So I did come across this article by Jason Vargas from the Department of Psychology at Northwestern University in a perspective titled The Impact of Socioeconomic Factors on Crime Rates. And he said that, quote, several theories help explain the relationship between socioeconomic factors and crime rates. Strain theory suggests that when individuals experience strain, when they are unable to achieve socially accepted goals, such as financial success or upward mobility, when faced with limited opportunities for legitimate success, some individuals may turn to criminal activities as an alternative means of achieving their goals. Social disorganization theory posits that high levels of poverty, residential instability, and community disorganization contribute to higher crime rates. Communities with limited resources, weak social networks, and a lack of formal and informal social control mechanisms are more likely to experience higher crime rates. And the economic deprivation theory emphasizes the role of economic inequality and a lack of access to resources that drives crime. And the frustration and relative deprivation experienced by individuals in disadvantaged communities can lead to increased criminal behavior as a response to perceived social and economic injustices. And education plays a crucial role in breaking the cycle of crime and poverty. Limited access to quality education hampers individuals' opportunities for personal and economic growth, increasing the likelihood of criminal involvement. Investing in educational resources, providing equal opportunities, and promoting vocational training can empower individuals and reduce crime rates. End quote. And I think that honestly, these theories were pretty spot on, and I feel like they all, in a way, perfectly encapsulate the situations that all four of the women were in Set It Off. Because again, each of them, they felt like they had no other options besides a life of crime, because they had really pressing issues that needed to be resolved with money. I did also come across this article on newamerica.org by Julia Craven, and basically she really breaks down just how deeply slavery still affects Black women today. And this specific article is kind of illuminating, and I have to check myself, okay, girl, don't be letting these people stress you out. She says that, quote, "Today, the legacy of enslavement on Black women's economic security, health, and care manifests as Black women who work full-time earn 67 cents to the dollar, earned by white men who work full-time." And she also says that Black women participate in the labor force at higher rates than women of other racial and ethnic backgrounds, yet experience higher unemployment and poverty rates than the national average for women. They are also more likely to be the head of households, meaning they care for their dependents with fewer resources. And we see this play out with rising childcare costs, which we can see that with TT and Set It Off, and any potential job disruptions due to lack of childcare, which again we see with TT. And she says that these are a more considerable burden on Black families, particularly Black mothers, compared to their white counterparts. Black women have a shorter life expectancy, a higher maternal mortality rate, and a higher disease burden, which refers to the physical and financial impact of certain diseases on specific populations. This includes being proportionally likely to die from breast cancer, heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease, stroke, and police violence, which can lead to increased preterm births of Black babies and other complicated health issues. Black women and children who live in segregated neighborhoods experience significant differences in employment and education attainment and limited access to a wealth of resources that could help lift them out of poverty. She says that Black women spend more time fighting for dignity in workplace policies and for their bodies due to a lack of adequate family supportive policies, which also move in tandem with decreased reproductive rights in many states. And I feel like this is really relevant today with our little raggedy ass president. And she says that the strong Black woman schema continues to demand that Black women swallow their pain for the greater good of others, and it comes with grave psychological consequences. Surviving in a profoundly racist society damages Black women physiologically, a process known as weathering. So the term weathering was coined by public health researcher Arlene Geronimus, and she defines this as chronic stress that literally wears down on your heart, your arteries, all your body systems, so that in effect you become chronologically old at a young age, end quote. And that was scary. And she goes on to say that chronic stress can increase susceptibility to depression, anxiety, feelings of isolation, and it can also cause headaches, chest pain, fatigue, and stomach issues. Heightened stress levels can make sleeping impossible, a requirement for quality health and well-being that is sadly already limited for many Black women. Stress can lead to high blood pressure, a weakened immune system, anxiety, depression, type 2 diabetes, and or memory loss. adverse health outcomes that Black people are disproportionately likely to experience compared to white Americans, end quote. And so that was her little spiel on the health effects that the legacy of slavery that it still has on all Black people, but specifically Black women in America. And honestly, seeing this in writing was so eye-opening because obviously slavery still affects everybody in America. And it's just kind of illuminating how everything is so connected, and it can be really disheartening because you can go to school and get a good education, marry well, find a good job, and do everything quote unquote the right way, and you can still end up having the rug pulled from up under you. Because at the end of the day, you can't really outwork the patriarchy or homophobia or any of the other isms. You can see this in the film because all four of the women are broken down by the multiple systems that are working against them at the same time every single day. And again, in the end, they all lose something. And by the end of the film, they were all dead except for Stoney. So what did she really gain? Because she doesn't have any community and she's now in this new environment with a new boatload of trauma. And I can just imagine what the road ahead will look like for Stoney. But again, she got a bus ticket to Mexico and a bag of cash. So I'm sure she can make something shake. And I guess that's something. And I remember as they were formulating the heist and just the plan of if they were going to actually do it or not, Frankie said something to the effect of, we're stealing what they already stole from us. Something that I noticed in all four of the main characters were their varying degrees of hopelessness and pessimism. And it was really sad. And but that hopelessness and pessimism kind of leads to just this level of carelessness with your life. And it's really sad. And when I say carelessness, I'm speaking more towards Cleo because she just seems really apathetic and she just kind of takes the world as it is. And yeah, she just seems really careless. She doesn't really dream or plan for the future, but neither does Stoney or Chi-Chi. But we do see that Stoney did have dreams for her younger brother to go to college, which, that didn't end up working out. And I would just assume that Chi-Chi would want her younger son to, build a life for himself. And Frankie, again, was on a straight arrow, slowly but surely climbing the corporate ladder until she was ripped down to the bottom because she was racially profiled, basically. And everything just fell apart for Frankie, and she just wasn't lucky. It just must be exhausting having to provide for your family without adequate support, and then having to go to work with a boss that constantly berates and disrespects you, and you're getting paid basically nothing. Like, they all were making minimum wage, and also they had to deal with whatever life throws at them. They are all still processing these very real traumas as well, and life still required for them to show up, and that's just really unfortunate, but that's just life. And it was just really exhausting watching this film as well because it just seemed like there was always something, and I'm sure people can relate to this as well. It just was always something that needed to be addressed, a problem that needed to be fixed. And the world doesn't stop just because you're having a bad day or just because you're broke or whatever. There were just all these problems that needed to be solved, but it just wasn't enough resources, and they just didn't have enough support. And honestly, the only time that each of these four women got to breathe was when they were with each other. It was giving very much waiting to exhale, but just the poor version. And when they first brought up robbing a bank, because they brought up the idea a few times, they actually decided to go through with it after a few different times with being brought up. Because there was always somebody who, had some sense and was just like, okay, let's be level-headed, and they would kind of sway the group back to reality. But throughout the film, they each got broken down one by one, and the final straw was TT getting her son taken away. And so that's when they just decided, we're going to have to get this money somehow, so let's just rob the bank. And they can't really just make money appear. They're not magicians. And so what other options did they really have? And I'm not condoning it, but again, what options did they really have? Because the system just fucked them every chance it got. So I did previously mention waiting to exhale because something that specifically I love about this film is just the emphasis on Black sisterhood. And it was just nice seeing four poor Black women in leading roles and just how much their bond carried them throughout the film. And I really like the emphasis that the writers and the director put on the sisterhood aspect of this film. Because it's so easy in general whenever you're in pursuit of a better life to just abandon those that are closest to you just in the name of getting to the bag. And it's constantly reinforced throughout the film that they are all in this together. They're not going to turn on each other at all. They all stuck together to the end. And I think that was admirable to an extent. This is a movie, and me personally, I like my freedom. I don't think I would ever like anybody more than I like my freedom, and nobody could convince me to rob a bank, but this is besides the point because I'm not in a movie. I feel like that sisterhood aspect of the film was just so important, and it was really nice and refreshing to see. And I think it reinforces just this idea, at least in my opinion, that the only people that poor Black women can depend on is usually other poor Black women. And I say poor Black women because we see in the beginning of the film how the only other Black female detective, Detective Waller, how she acted whenever Frankie was first being interrogated and basically being racially profiled. Frankie did not know that man from a can of paint. They just lived in the same neighborhood, and she just watched as Frankie got fired. Even though, some could argue that that wasn't really her place because she's the police and it's her job to figure out who did what crime. She's not really there to, she's there to do a job first and foremost. It was mostly the other detective, Detective Strode, who was leading the interrogation and who was really being very pointed in his accusation that Frankie just had to be connected to the robbery in some way. And it's interesting because after Frankie gets fired, she's having this breakdown or whatever, but as she's gathering her things and leaving, she does make a point to stop and address Detective Waller and say, like, damn, like, you couldn't even offer me a sip of water? Because as this whole thing is going down, Detective Waller is just kind of standing there in the corner drinking her water and, just watching the shit go down. That was really interesting to me because Frankie, she's going through it. They are all just coming at her from different angles. It's like, you got to be in on this, where you know him from, we know your kind, this, that, and the third. You not working here no more. And she's just like going around begging for these people to have some level of compassion and understanding for her. She literally still has blood on her clothes. Detective Waller, which was the only other Black person and the only other Black woman in the room, she just kind of sat there in the corner and drank her water and minded her business. That is when, in my opinion, when things can get dicey, especially when you're a minority in proximity to whiteness and power. She was basically a fly on the wall, and she could have given her some type of assistance or did something during the interrogation, but she didn't. And then we also come across another Black character, which was the love interest of Stoney. His name is Keith. And I believe that he works in the finance department of the federal bank, which is the final bank that they end up robbing at the end of the film. And basically, they end up meeting because Stoney and TT were like keeping the scene at the bank and like trying to get intel before they decide to rob it. And he sees her and he's just like, oh, I want to hang out with you. I think you're beautiful. Let me take you on a date. And they eventually start chit-chatting it up, but he's unaware that she's this robber. You can also see the dynamic in between him because he's this upper class Black Harvard graduate and he works in finance and he doesn't really understand poverty and just how the systems can actively work against you when you just are born at a disadvantage. He just doesn't really understand just how debilitating the reality of poverty is because he's never experienced it. And of course, any human can feel empathy, but some people really do think that living an abundant, amazing life is just a result of hard work and deservedness. And that's the case for some, but not all. And this is made clear when Keith asks Stoney like where she sees herself in 5 years, and she basically doesn't have an answer. She's just like, But then Keith, he starts to go off on a tangent, basically saying something to the effect of like, see, this is what's wrong with our people. We don't ever plan for the future, and this is Black people's problem. And that's just not the reality that Stoney lives in. They live in two separate worlds. And it's not as simple as pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, because if it was that simple, I'm sure they would do it. But yeah, again, Stoney, she's just trying to make it to the next day. They have too many challenges today to try and figure out what challenges tomorrow will bring. But what I love about this film is that it does a really great job of capturing that pessimism and apathy that many disenfranchised groups feel. And again, it just kind of, you just get to see how there is always something that needs to be addressed. And that is debilitating and weathering. Every day it weathers on you. And also there's this class and social divide between Detective Waller, which is the Black detective, and Frankie, and there's this class and social divide between Keith and Stoney. And yeah, I just found that dynamic really interesting because Frankie, she is working a decent job. Of course, she was a bank teller, and I'm just assuming, she had a little bit of a financial cushion, and she was probably making enough to live comfortably, but not enough to really have any upward mobility in life because she was still staying in the hood. And we don't really know too much about Detective Waller, but I think it's safe to assume that working as a detective has some sort of financial cushion, and I think it's safe to assume that also she's in a different and probably better financial situation than Frankie was. Detective Waller, she has this proximity to whiteness and power that she's not willing to compromise, and she's not really willing to go out on a limb for another Black woman. And obviously, again, the boss had fired Frankie. The police don't have anything to do with that. They're not her supervisors, but they really didn't help leading up to her firing because they kind of painted her out to be an accomplice. They did not treat her as a victim or as somebody who was just recently traumatized. You know, she had a gun pointed at her, and she did see somebody get unalived literally a few feet away from her, and now she don't have a job. And I just felt conflicted every time Detective Waller showed up on the screen because, first and foremost, she had a job to do, which was getting criminals off the street. That's the job. That's her reason for being there, first and foremost. And again, she does not know Frankie from a can of paint. Detective Stroh was leading the interrogation. She didn't really say anything as far as how she felt. Usually when there is some form of injustice, specifically in context of Black women, you would expect for the other person who shares some form of identity with you to kind of come to your defense whenever you're being mistreated. And I don't know, that's why I kind of feel like conflicted in this push and pull, because I like to reject the notion that Black women are saviors and that we should be held to a higher standard, because that's a burden that we don't deserve. And I refuse to carry that burden to a certain degree. I mean, I look for all my Black women now. But I do think it's also important that we Black women look out for one another, because if we don't, then who will? We don't know what the repercussions could have been had Detective Waller had tried to intervene and come to Frankie's defense, because at the end of the day got in, and she is there to do a job, which means she needs to get paid. And would you potentially sacrifice your livelihood for a complete stranger? I don't know. Like, that's why I just felt so conflicted. But I also don't think it's fair to hold Detective Waller to that standard. But it was just a really impossible situation. I just felt like all the Black women in the film, even Detective Waller, they were all kind of put in situations to where they were in between a rock and a hard place. So it's kind of just like, you just got to make a decision and just go with it. And it really is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because again, when you are poor and Black, the only real community that you have and the only real safety net that you have is other poor and Black people. And we see this illustrated many times throughout the film. Cleo, Stoney, TT, and Frankie, they can only really depend on each other, and they're all tapped out. And for every person that makes it out of the hood or makes it out of poverty, there are dozens who didn't, and they were dozens who tried but just didn't. And yeah, I really don't blame them for their apathetic attitudes, because they really tried to do the best of their situation, but life just kept on kicking them down. And that's the reality for a lot of poor Black women who are just experiencing disappointment and mistreatment in multiple areas of their lives. But life goes on. And it's just hard when you have to battle workplace harassment, poverty, relationships, taking care of your family. And it's just too much. It's just too much. It was just too much. And it's pretty common for Black women who are poor, queer, and or disabled to rely on their community, whether it's a chosen family or not. And I think everyone, especially Black women, should go where they are loved and embraced, because it is hard out here for them. And this is a little off topic, but as I was doing this video and doing research, somebody who came to thought was Dr. Antoinette Candia Bailey. And if you don't know, Dr. Antoinette, she was a former VP of Student Affairs at Lincoln University in Missouri, and she tragically took her life on January 8th, 2024, after being terminated from her position. And there were allegations that she was facing workplace harassment, specifically from the president of the university. His name is John B. Mosley, and he is white. And if you don't know, Lincoln University is an HBCU, so I don't understand how you become president of an HBCU and you're Caucasian, but that alone pissed me off. But anyways, that whole situation was so devastating because there were so many failures along the way that could have prevented this terrible tragedy. Because first and foremost, how does a former coach who is Caucasian become the president of an HBCU? Like, it didn't make any sense. And it was also really interesting because she wrote one of her theses, because she wrote a thesis on the challenges of being a woman of color in the workplace and just the different challenges that women of color face in the workplace. And so I do think there was a lot of writing on the wall. She was allegedly pretty upfront about her situation and her mental health struggles. And she really wasn't met with any compassion, allegedly, and she wasn't really directed towards any resources to help. And it was just really infuriating as I was reading up on this story, just that this man, this white man, felt emboldened enough to allegedly harass and push her out of her job. And who else knows what she was dealing with in her personal life? And I'm just pointing this out because first and foremost, she deserves justice. Because John, he was on a paid leave, and there was an internal investigation being conducted by the university, but they didn't find anything, and he was reinstated to his job and cleared up any wrongdoing. So he's still the president there to this day. He still works there at Lincoln University, the president. So first and foremost, I want to say RIP to Dr. Antoinette Candia Bailey. She deserved better, and so do the fictional characters of Set It Off. So yeah, just to wrap this up, Black women, take care of yourself, use your PTO, and don't let these folks stress you out, because they will if you let them. And don't rob banks, or do. It's your life. Don't go to jail. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, if you haven't seen Set It Off, I urge you to watch it. And if you have seen it, then watch it again. It's an amazing film, and I'll never get tired of it. Again, Queen Latifah deserved an Oscar for this. She deserved an Oscar for a lot of things, but that's another video for another day. But yes, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out planetsyd.net. It is our community that is growing, and I think you guys will really enjoy planetsyd.net. Also, be sure to check out my makeup brand, theboxofficebeauty.com, and my clothing brand, Main Character, The Label. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys feel safe and seen wherever you are. And I hope you guys are finding joy and fulfillment on your journey of self-expression. Until next time.